This is Northwest Reports. I'm Maliha Sayed. It's hard to ignore the growing threat of climate change. We're already seeing its impacts, from wildfires to hurricanes, droughts to floods. 2024 was the planet's hottest year on record, and Washington state faces it all, too. Melting snowpack, rising sea levels, extreme weather, and more. Former Governor Jay Inslee was known for his focus on climate. He spearheaded a lot of Washington's efforts in recent years to cut greenhouse gas emissions. That includes efforts to build large-scale wind and solar projects in the state. And while these efforts sound good to some, these are huge projects that require a lot of land, and locations are selected by private companies. So these projects have also faced consistent backlash for all kinds of reasons from a lot of different groups.
There's no visual break. I mean, we're going to see wind turbines in every direction.
This permit that has no authority, real authority, it has 1,000 interpretations, but it trumps this actual history. And to me, that hurts. How dare they compare this beautiful sacred history to this procedural process?
This is the first of 3 episodes in a series we're calling It's Not Easy Going Green. In it, we're going to explore the backlash to these clean energy projects and the bureaucratic forces standing in the way of efforts to mitigate climate change. Some welcome these developments, but others say they're going to disrupt their communities, their landscapes, and their entire way of life. We're going to tell these stories with the help of Brandon Block, an investigative journalist at Cascade PBS who's been reporting on the turmoil around these clean energy efforts. In this first episode, Brandon takes us to Horseheaven Hills, a region that's slated to house one of the state's most contentious clean energy projects, a wind farm that could feature more than 200 turbines. The project was proposed 4 years ago by Colorado-based Scout Clean Energy, but its future remains uncertain because of very public resistance from bird conservationists, tribal nations, the local government, and homeowners. We'll tell you about some of their concerns, and we'll take you along on our trip to Toppenish, where we met a Yakama Nation leader who called the project a violation of nature's law. Their collective resistance to this particular project also speaks to the bigger question: what are the sacrifices that local communities may have to make in order to stave off an urgent climate crisis? And is compromise even possible? Okay, Brandon, what is the Horseheaven Hills Wind Project, and how did you first hear about it?
The Horseheaven Hills would be the largest wind energy facility in the state of Washington. It's been proposed for an area just outside of the Tri-Cities in central Washington, atop a fairly prominent ridgeline that can be seen from the Tri-Cities. The project would entail, as originally proposed, more than 200 wind turbines that would stretch across this ridgeline. I started getting interested in the Horseheaven Hills last April when a state permitting body voted to recommend cutting the project in half. And then something interesting happened, and this is what caught my attention, which is that Governor Inslee at the time, who was at the time governor, he stepped in and he basically said no. He rejected their decision, and he essentially ordered a redo, told them to come back with a different recommendation that kept more of the turbines, essentially, made it closer to the original proposal. And this is kind of a rare step. The governor does have the power to do this, but he previously didn't use it very often. And I think it reflects what a heated and particularly controversial project this has been. The project has been approved, but there has been 3 lawsuits already that were filed seeking to revoke the site permit. And so that will now go to the Washington State Supreme Court, which will weigh in on whether this project goes forward or not. So this process isn't over yet.
Can you describe the community in that area? Is it a big population? Is it a little more rural?
So the Tri-Cities is Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco. And I want to say it's over 300,000 people who live in that urban area. I will say, just from having traveled there, it feels quite diffuse, I think, because there are these 3 separate cities, and it's quite sprawling once you get outside the downtown area of each city, it becomes pretty rural pretty quickly. And I just mentioned that because one of the things that was brought up to me by many people that I talked to was this idea that they want to preserve, what they'll call the rural character of this area.
Can you talk a little bit about why this wind power project was proposed here in this region?
So there's been a pretty noticeable increase in proposals for wind and solar facilities in the last couple of years.
Today in Seattle, Governor Jay Inslee signed a package of bills in response to climate change. One new law transitions the state of Washington to 100% renewable energy by the year 2045.
Part of that is the impact of the federal climate subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act. We're seeing it here because Central Washington, unlike Western Washington, is sunny most of the year. And so it's a desirable place to site particularly solar facilities. It also just has a lot of open space. The 2019 Clean Energy Transformation Act set a pretty ambitious goal of completely decarbonizing Washington's energy grid by 2045. Obviously, as everyone knows, climate change is an enormous challenge that is extremely urgent. There are going to be extraordinary ecological consequences if we don't decarbonize our grid really fast. And in order to do that, we're going to need to bring a large number of new energy facilities online. The current projections show that Washington is going to, at the very least, need to double its power output by 2050. And that's not even accounting for, these projections are constantly changing. Particularly in the last year, we've learned a lot about the new demands that things like data centers and AI are projected to place on the grid. And so those numbers, generally speaking, continue to go up.
So you and I got to go to Toppenish recently to meet with Jerry Meneinik. Who is he and why did you want to meet with him?
We did. Yeah, we took a little road trip out to Toppenish. How's your day going?
Oh, fine.
Jerry Meneinik is a former tribal chairman of the Yakama Nation and currently serves as their deputy director of culture. He also has an important role in the tribe's spiritual life. He performs funerals. He told me that he's officiated some 200 funerals in the last several years. I wanted to talk to Jerry particularly because he was one of the tribal elders who was selected by the Yakama Nation to testify before the state permitting committee that we've been talking about, FSEC.
We're going to spend almost all of episode 2 diving into FSEC, which stands for the Energy Facilities Site Evaluation Council, including the complaints that folks on all sides have about it. But for now, Brandon, can you tell me a little bit about what FSEC is?
FSEC is a state body that processes applications for energy facilities and makes decisions about where those facilities can be permitted and under what circumstances. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about objections to the Horse Heaven Hills project and a little bit more about why this area is so important to the tribes and the spiritual life of the tribe. And this is something that Jerry reiterated throughout our conversation, that it is really hard to explain. It's something that you have to sort of feel and live. But simply put, he described the Horse Heaven Hills as part of the tribe's religion. He actually, at one point, compared it to the role that Notre Dame plays in Christian theology, that it's that sacred.
If I drove down there right now and we stopped and got off the rig and to look at land, the first thing I would do is get off and introduce myself to the land so it would know who was there. And then I would speak to the land only in our language because that's the language it understands. Those are the guidances that we received from our elders.
So the Yakama Nation is one of a few groups that is pushing back on this project. Why are they opposed to it?
So they made a number of different arguments, but I think one thing that's important to remember here is that we're talking about land that, although it is currently owned by private and state landowners, It was once a part of the vast holdings of the Yakama Nation and many other tribal nations. And that land, which they refer to as their ceded lands, that was relinquished by them in 1855 under a treaty that was signed between the state of Washington and these various tribes. And that treaty, it essentially formalized colonization. The tribes relinquished their land, but they did so in exchange for certain guarantees that they could continue using that land, continue using all of those usual and accustomed places, as the way that the treaty describes it. And those treaties, all treaties, are regarded by the United States Constitution as the law, the supreme law of the land. So these are rights that states have an obligation to uphold. And what the tribe would say is that this wind farm would actually transform the land in such a way as to fundamentally alter and jeopardize their ability to access it in the way that this treaty contemplates. And so, yeah, their argument would very much be that this is a violation of this contract that they have with the United States government that is above the state. And so they don't recognize the authority of the state here.
We live spiritually, and these ties are serious to us. And I first of all told our barristers, I'm not going to talk to you or to a court or to some attorney, prosecutor, or whatever. No. How they can accept forgiveness if they don't even understand that they're violating nature's law?
In his view, the state permitting council doesn't understand what he's talking about when he says that the land is interconnected with the spiritual life of the tribe and all these other things. There was a big disagreement between the tribe and the developer over what constitutes a quote-unquote traditional cultural property. And this is something that, by law, FSEC is obligated to protect against damage to things that are considered TCPs, is the analogy, is the shorthand. But this is sort of a difficult thing to define legally. The developer argued that for something to be a cultural property, it has to be a specific thing. But of course, what the tribe is saying is that this entire area, this entire landscape, how it looks, is a part of their culture.
What do you think it would take for Jerry to okay a project like this?
I did ask him at one point if there was any type of compromise that, whether it's reducing the scope of the project, resiting it to a slightly different location, other types of measures that would allow this type of project to coexist without harming tribal culture. And he said no.
Compromise is a pretty tough word. This tribe doesn't compromise, and it wouldn't. I guess the thing that would offer us a seat at the table would be honesty. And we haven't received that yet.
It's also worth mentioning that there are multiple other wind and solar projects that have been proposed for areas that are sacred to not just tribes in general, but specifically to the Yakama Nation. The Badger Mountain solar facility, the pumped hydro storage in Goldendale down in Klickitat County. There's a number of these projects. He also expressed a broader skepticism of this push for industrial scale renewable energy, which he said he views as largely a front for the needs of data centers, these big power-hungry things that power AI and the internet. He pointed out that they're often foreign corporations who are developing these facilities. To be fair to the Yakama Nation, they would also say that they're not uniformly against renewable energy. And in fact, they're actually working on their own solar project that they recently got a $32 million federal grant to pursue. And I asked Jerry, why this solar project, but not that wind project? And he said that he sees the tribe's efforts as different from what developers like Scout are doing with the Horse Heaven Hills.
The Yakama Nation's in support of solar panels, wind power, if it's done correctly. But no, these other guys, they want to go ahead and destroy large acres of land. They don't have no sense of contribution back to once those panels or those windmills are done, to put the land back in its original setting.
I understand there are other groups who are opposed to the Horse Heaven Hills project, partly because they're worried about wildlife in the area. What are they worried about? And what could this project mean for some of the wildlife in the region?
Yeah, so the siting board originally wanted to curtail the size of this project. When they made that decision, they talked a lot about the impacts to this bird, the ferruginous hawk, which is considered endangered in Washington. Yeah, basically the idea was that they were putting these 2-mile buffer zones around areas where the bird had historically nested in an attempt to protect that habitat. And that ended up having the impact of significantly curtailing the size of the project.
Do you get a sense about how some of these conservationists square their particular concern with the wildlife species with this broader drive to combat climate change? Because they're both environmental concerns, but they're at totally different scales.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and one that I put to Adam Maxwell. He's a senior policy manager at the Audubon Society, and their position is that they were very clear that they're extremely concerned about the urgent reality of climate change and very much support clean energy, but they feel that we don't need to sacrifice biodiversity in order to achieve our climate goals.
From our perspective, we don't think that we should have to. We think that there's ways to minimize and avoid impacts for specific projects, to mitigate when we have to, and to try to help use that mitigation to create more habitat. We need our state to kind of step up and be proactive about trying to push projects towards the right locations and have them have the right design specifications so that we're not sacrificing endangered species that the state does want to recover.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but there's maybe potentially like a false choice that we can do both. We can protect endangered species and produce the renewable energy that we need. And those don't necessarily have to be opposed goals.
I think, yeah, you put words in my mouth, but they were the right ones.
So they supported the initial proposal to reduce the scope of the project in an effort to protect the bird. And they told me that they thought that it was a reasonable compromise. Obviously, since then, the governor has come in and asked the council to bring back a number of those wind turbines and sort of re-enlarge the project. And they were not thrilled with that.
And Benton County has also been publicly opposed to this project. What is their perspective on it?
So Benton County currently has a moratorium on wind and solar facilities being sited, which they've had in place for several years. Their concerns are largely centered on land use and agriculture. Benton County has argued that converting land from agricultural use to this kind of industrial energy facility is harmful to the broader agricultural economy. And they have argued in numerous legal filings that they have an obligation to protect farmland under the Growth Management Act. Our current system as it's set up allows the state to come in and circumvent the local land use policies.
So, Brandon, you went on a tour of Horse Heaven Hills. When did you go and what was that like?
Yeah, I did. So I went this past October with this guy named Paul Crouppen. He's part of a group called Tri-Cities Cares, and they were founded really to push back on this wind proposal. He drove me all around the project site where the wind turbines would go in and sort of showed me the lay of the land. But this is still the hills where we are right now? Oh, yeah. This is all the Horse Heaven Hills. Gotcha. Imagine a very arid desert-like place, kind of a brown canyon, a lot of like golden wheat fields. So it's a really striking kind of desert landscape.
And there were a couple of people on the tour, but I'm curious to hear initially about Paul. Is he the leader of this group? It seems like you had kind of the most extensive conversation with him.
Yeah, Paul is definitely the person who has really taken on this mission with the most vigor. He is retired. He did work for a long time for the Bonneville Power Administration as an attorney, has been retired for quite a while, and has really taken up this cause. He lives in the area. He told me he can actually see there's a different wind farm that he can see from his house. You know, in some ways, he is maybe kind of an unlikely candidate to play this role. You know, he's originally from New York, told me he's a lifelong Democrat. There is definitely a dynamic in this debate where, you know, the Tri-Cities is generally a pretty conservative area. Its elected leaders are Republicans. There's, I think it's fair to say, a strong animosity to Governor Inslee, former Governor Inslee now, and his climate agenda. There is a strong feeling that this clean energy is being pushed on central Washington from the government in Olympia. You know, we have to look at the wind turbines for this energy that is being produced for the rest of the state for, you know, to benefit the governor's agenda in Olympia.
Pick a site where there's little or no impact on people and the environment and animals and things you care about. Why should hundreds of thousands of people take a disproportionate share of the impact? Should not allow that to happen. You live in Seattle, you got a clean environment, you're not dealing with this. Sure, you got an urban environment, but that's not what we have here. Don't urbanize people. That's an unwanted intrusion. It changes their lives from outside.
So I was also in the car with Dave Sharp and Pam Minnelli, who are two other board members of Tri-City Cares, both retired. Dave is also a former energy guy. He worked in power plants across the country, mostly fossil fuel, but also some renewables as well. You know, we talked about a lot of different things, but the conversation kept coming back to how is this going to impact views? How is this going to impact property values? And, you know, sort of just general quality of life things.
So when you're talking about what you're going to see, think about the Space Needle. So this is like in some of these higher areas, it's 2,000 feet elevation, and then you put a Space Needle on top of that. So they're going to be seen from a long ways.
We're going to be restricted on our firefighting capabilities by putting those turbines right along the ridge. Will keep us from using the county from using the resources they used to 3-4 years ago.
A few days ago, we received an email from a woman. She and her husband just moved into the Tri-Cities and bought a house with a view. And they weren't told about the wind farm. She wishes they had known that prior to buying this house because it would have made a difference.
So, I mean, these are people who, for the most part, have some background in energy, yet they're here opposing this clean energy project, which is intended to combat climate change. Do you get a sense of how they sort of square these two?
I mean, I asked them, do you think that we need to make sacrifices to deal with climate change? And, you know, they all said that they believe in climate change and they believe that there are going to be serious consequences for our emitting of carbon into the atmosphere. So they're not denying the reality of climate change. I think they just all felt that they didn't want to be the ones to have to bear those consequences.
This is the decision that Inslee is making. He's basically making a decision that we're going to force the sacrifice on the Tri-Cities.
Paul's thing is that he's a nuclear guy. He feels that renewables are not going to be able to generate the power that we need, and he thinks that nuclear will be a more efficient way of generating that power.
We got to do something else. We've got to mitigate better. We've got to produce better, and you know, got to control the emissions better. And these things cost money. I mean, it's really they're looking for low cost. Everybody thinks, wind is free, solar is free. The light coming out of the sky. They're not taking reality into account. It's a perception, and that's part of the tragedy of this whole situation right now. Is that too many people believe the myth.
So what do you make of all of this?
I think a generous interpretation of what Paul's saying there is there's a tendency to think about renewable energy as something that doesn't come with its own costs. And I think he's fairly pointing out that every energy facility has impacts, even something like wind and solar that we know are broadly good for the climate. I think like a fair point to make, which Paul has made, is that solar panels require mining for metals to make those solar panels. Every infrastructure project has an impact on the earth. Even one that we know is broadly good for the climate is going to impact the local ecosystem in some way. In the Northwest, we have this long history with dams. We know that on the one hand, Washington has one of the cleanest grids in the country, and we've been able to accomplish that because of hydroelectric power. But we also know that the dams have had a devastating impact on the salmon population. Paul would say that this is not just about his personal views and property values, but I think he would also admit, and he has to me in conversations, that there is an element of not in my backyard-ism to this whole conversation.
Where does the Horse Heaven Hills project stand as of right now?
So it's kind of in a limbo phase right now. It has been approved by the state permitting council. They went back as the governor demanded, and they made a different recommendation that should result in more turbines being reclaimed for the project. It's not totally clear what the size of the project will be. They kind of punted those decisions to this advisory group that they've created, but it seems likely that it will be a larger project closer to what was originally envisioned. But then after that, there were multiple lawsuits filed by some of the people that we've talked about already, by Paul Krupin's group, Tri-City Cares, by Benton County, and also by the Yakama Nation. So 3 different lawsuits seeking to have that permit revoked. And so now we will have a state court weigh in on largely procedural questions about whether the council followed its own statutory rules in making this decision. And that is currently filed in Thurston County Superior Court. It could go up to the Supreme Court. It'll be months before any of that is sorted out.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about this particular wind project at Horse Heaven Hills, but why is this important?
I think it forces us to confront this very stark and important question, which I'll phrase like this: what are we willing to sacrifice to get our economy off of fossil fuels? There are going to be some really tough choices that we're going to have to make. The climate crisis demands urgent action. And I guess particularly thinking about it through the lens of the siting council, they're tasked with making extremely complicated value judgments about what impacts are acceptable in order to make this transition that we know we need. I think one of the things that the Horse Heaven Hills project forces us to ask is, are we willing to accept losing some bird habitat in order to generate the carbon-free electricity we need to get our grid off fossil fuels? The Audubon Society would say, no, that's not an acceptable compromise. The other people would say, if we want to have a planet to live on at all, including for birds, we're going to need to build 20 more of these facilities immediately. And that was one of the things that the governor said, was this facility represents maybe 5% of the electricity generation we need. So we're going to need to build a ton more of these things. And I think we're going to face very similar, if not these exact challenges with these other projects. It also forces us to confront a somewhat unpleasant history of the impacts that energy facilities have had on tribal nations. One of the things that the Energy Council has to decide is, are they willing to push this project through over the objections of the Yakama Nation, who has said that this will have inalterable impacts on landscape that they consider to be spiritually sacred to them? So it forces us to ask some really difficult and existential questions about what kind of sacrifices we're willing to make to confront climate change.
These questions are top of mind for the people in Washington who have to answer them fast in the middle of so many community concerns. One key player in this conversation about climate change is FSEC, the state body Brandon mentioned earlier that can override local bans on clean energy projects. In the next episode of It's Not Easy Going Green from Northwest Reports, you'll hear more about FSEC's role in the energy transition and concerns from legislators and community members about the power the unelected group holds over local land use decisions. Thanks for listening to the first episode of It's Not Easy Going Green by Northwest Reports. Be sure to check out the next 2 episodes, which are available wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was reported by Brandon Block. It was produced by me, Maliha Sayed, and Sarah Bernard. The story editor was Ryan Famuliner. Our executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to Northwest Reports wherever you listen. And whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. Northwest Reports is made possible by listeners like you. Your support will tell the stories that shape Washington State. Join the members who help us create Northwest Reports. Your donation will be put to work right away, delivering the Cascade PBS lineup of podcasts, video docuseries, and daily in-depth reporting you and so many rely on. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive great member benefits, including Cascade PBS Passport with extended access to an on-demand library of local and PBS favorites. Go to cascadepbs.org/NW reports to sign up today. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit cascadepbs.org. That's also where you'll find It's Not Easy Going Green. Northwest Reports is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Maliha Sayed. We'll be back soon with another episode.